Okay, I want to pick back up discussing master and slave morality in the first essay of the Genealogy of Morals by Nietzsche. And one of the most important sections is section 10 of the first essay, where Nietzsche goes much more deeper into the psychological origins of slave morality, which is what he's interested in. Because remember, slave morality is how he characterizes Christianity, which is how he characterizes Western culture to a certain extent. Our values in Western culture are Christian, and those Christian values are slavish. That is, they come out of a weak perspective of will to power. Okay, so he begins section 10, and I'm just going to go through this and comment a little bit, and I'll break these videos up into a few of them. The slave revolt, so notice already, it's a revolt. It's a revolt against who? The masters, the people with power. The slave revolt in morality begins when resentment, or ressentiment, he uses the French word, when ressentiment itself becomes creative and gives birth to values. Now, ressentiment is the most important word probably in this whole book. Resentment, he uses the French, or the English is the same, resentment, sentiment means to feel, and obviously again. So he uses the word resentment because it's a re-feeling. He thinks slave morality is characterized by resentment, ressentiment, precisely because, and he thinks this word captures it, the slave continues to let this weak feeling, that the anger and the hatred and the revenge that arises from this feeling of impotency, he continues to relive it over and over again. And so when you're resentful, when you're bitter, you won't let it go. You can't express it. This is the other thing. It's not that you won't let it go, as you can't let it go, in another sense. Okay? So he thinks when you let this feeling of impotency, felt as resentment, fester in there, it becomes creative and gives birth to values. So out of the perspective of weakness comes the feeling of resentment, which gives birth to values. It becomes creative. Think about this. Think about someone who's really bitter when something bad happens to you or to someone you know, and they say, that's all right, what goes around comes around. That's all right, karma. Karma doesn't exist, right? I mean, well, maybe it does. I don't know. I don't think so. What are we doing? We're purging in our mind. We're imagining the person who slighted us as we're enacting imaginary revenge in our mind. Nietzsche thinks the best example of this, of course, is hell, the Christian version of hell, where all your enemies, all the people who have power over you, are just tortured forever and ever. Right? I mean, if you look at some of the sayings in the gospel, Nietzsche just sees resentment all over them, or thinks rather, maybe not that Jesus was resentful, although he seems to suggest that in section 8, paragraph 8. But woe to the rich. They're going to have their reward. Blessed are the poor. Right? Easier for a camel to go through the eye of a needle than for a rich person to enter heaven. But blessed are the poor. The poor will inherit the kingdom of heaven. The first will be last, and the last will be first. Nietzsche sees he sees Christianity and the slave revolt as inverting the values of the masters to a certain extent, where the masters become evil. Remember, we're thinking in terms of good and evil, and our resentment is directed imaginarily at them in our mind. And that's what he means by creating values. Okay, so when resentment itself becomes created and gives birth to values, the resentment of natures that are denied their true reaction, that of deeds, and compensate themselves with imaginary revenge. Okay? So in other words, I can't take revenge. I can't, picture someone who's in a superior position than you, a boss at work or something, who just treats you terribly, and you can't say anything unless you want to lose your job. You're completely impotent. You're completely powerless. That powerlessness will enable you to be resentful and enable you to create imaginary scenarios of revenge in your mind. Now, the greatest of these, he thinks, if you were to take all of the latent resentment of weak human beings, of slavish human beings, of people in a position of weakness throughout the centuries, and were to condense that resentment into one creative fictional ideology, you could summarize it with this one word: God. God. God is the idea of an absolute resentment and denial of life for Nietzsche.